So all week long I've been watching what has become, I think, the internet's favorite new video. Who has seen this thing? It's a guy being interviewed on the BBC. Who's seen this thing? Okay, about half of us. Who's seen it more than 10 times? I've watched it quite an offensively high number of times. I just weep every time. So there's this guy, he's very serious, he's very professional looking, he's got his tie on and his suit, and he's sitting in what seems to be his home office, being interviewed live streamed in on the BBC, and he's a foreign affairs expert. He's very kind of important looking, and he's talking about North Korea and the issues that are arising there. When the door opens behind him, and his 3-year-old comes marching in, just like this. And she comes up right behind him, and he stares at the camera, he's talking North Korea, and he starts pushing her back. She gets to about, just out of reach, and leans back and opens some string cheese and starts eating it. And then the door opens again, and a toddler, or like a baby, comes in, one of those little wheeled baby things, and starts like running and like completely oblivious. Oh. And then you see this woman, the mom, come screaming into the room, and she's crawling because she thinks she can't be seen by the camera. And she grabs both kids by the arm, and they start screaming, and he gets them out of the door, and she lunges and closes the door on her knees. And the guy's just like, his face goes, oh, and he's like, I'm sorry, it's very British. So back to North Korea. And it's a wonderful video because I can relate to it so well. And it's just hilarious. I don't know if it's schadenfreude where you take pleasure in other people's discomfort, but hopefully it's just me relating to this guy who's in this kid situation. I didn't know that. My kids aren't here right now, but if you have been here when they're here, you've experienced this thing. You just try to go forward with kids. But the thing that I've been watching this video over and over again, the thing I keep thinking about is the conversation that happened in the house after the video was done between these two parents and what they talked about. And I wonder, was it a screaming match? Did they start hurling, accusations at each other and start dusting off old grievances and marshal them to their aid so that the battle of conflict could be won? I mean, what was it like in this household? Or was it just so utterly awful that they didn't even talk about it? They didn't want to broach the subject. They just said, let's forget about it and move on. Did one of them take all the blame? I mean, maybe the guy was supposed to work from his office that day. I mean, why was he taking a BBC interview in his home office with a toddler and a baby? I mean, come on, it's 101. But maybe he was supposed to be out of the house, and then now the wife feels ashamed, and she's saying, why did you do this? Or the other way around, and he's saying, you said you were going to take care of them. Like, what were you thinking, letting them walk in there? Or maybe they took a look at that video, and they laughed their faces off, and they realized that now like 100 million people have seen his talk on North Korea, which is probably more than it would have otherwise. And they put on that beautiful poem, that immortal psalm of Taylor Swift, hate is gonna hate, 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 play is gonna play, so shake it off, shake it off. And they sang that to each other, and they let it go. I mean, I don't know what happened in that household, but it's got me thinking about conflict. All month long here at Valley Mountain, we're talking about the myths of community. It's the season of Lent right now, and in Lent, it's traditionally a time for sort of self-examination of your own life and your spiritual life. At Valley Mountain this year, we're looking at how do we take that just beyond our personal life and talk about our relationships, our community life. Let's do some real examination of who we are as a community and how we relate to different forms of community in our life, whether that's our spouse, our partner, our kids, our co-workers, our neighbors, all those different relationships. Let's take a deep, long, loving look at how we relate to each other and burst through some of the myths of community. And today we're talking about conflict. That the myth is there is no conflict in community. And a lot of us seem to operate like that. It's like if there's a conflict, we think that somehow there's a sickness, there's something terribly wrong, there's something that must be either cut out or washed over or ignored in some way, that conflict is a sign of real sickness. And so we want to pretend that it's not there, and that real community doesn't have conflict. I know for me, one of my challenges with conflict is I adopt a sort of a blame approach. The other day I was really late to this meeting because of completely my own fault, but on MLK, you know, when you're crossing MLK going like up Beacon Hill, sometimes the light rail comes, right? And it's coming in there, and then you get the red light, and then it's like a double red light because when the light rail comes. And I was in this situation, and all of it happened because some guy was crossing in a crosswalk in front of me, and so I couldn't get the green light, so I had to wait through 2 red lights. And I was so mad at this guy for exercising his right to walk at his own pace and in a completely appropriate way. And then I started getting mad at the light rail builders for they should have built an underground tunnel or a raised platform or something like that. And then I'm mad at, Freddie, my wife, for, I don't know, I'm sure she was involved in this somehow. And, everybody becomes an object of blame sometimes. Can anybody relate to this? I mean, when you're in this, you're looking for someone else, it has to be their responsibility. And I think a lot of us struggle with approaching conflict in this way because we just have to be right. And sometimes we don't even voice it. Sometimes that's just how we feel, but that's not how we necessarily, we just swallow it whole. And so what I often see is kind of 2 major approaches that people have to conflict, 2 unhealthy approaches. It's the fight or the flight. The flight is when we don't know what to do and we just swallow the conflict. We avoid it at all costs. And I think that, we've all been in conflict, so I want to draw from some of the wisdom in the room right now. What are some of the reasons that you, if you're this type of person, or someone you know, if you don't want to admit, avoid conflict at all costs? Why is that? You can just call that out. Fear.
Well, I find that lately I've been telling myself that not to grumble, because the more grumbling noises you make, the worse you're making your life. In other words, you're making people mad at you and making people irritated. So you just kind of like don't grumble and just kind of try to go through life in a not grumbly way, then you're happier in the long run.
Yeah. Well, a good defense of avoiding. Right, and there are times when conflict, not every single thing has to be brought up. Absolutely. Angela, I saw your hand.
I'm not one to avoid conflict, but I did a nice job last week and I walked away from something. But I realized the reason why is because I wanted to have a better formed argument to go back later. So I needed a little time to, and patience with myself. But I guess I would say you would walk away from conflict if you were shocked that just happened to you. I think that there was something that happened in my heart. I'm like, I can't believe that was just said. I need to just leave.
Yeah.
It was like fearful.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard somebody else say fear. You want to elaborate on that at all?
Well, I don't really run away from conflict. I don't think I do anyway. But I do notice a lot of people don't enter into a situation because they're afraid of that result. What if I'm on the losing side? Or what if I win, but I alienate that other person so badly that they don't want to talk to me anymore?
Yeah, I think a lot of us, one of my challenges with it is I don't want to break the relationship. I'm worried if I bring up the conflict, somehow we'll never be able to reconcile and we can't recover from that. It's a fear.
So I avoid conflict because it allows me to play both parts in my head, and I'm almost a winner. My brother and I are kind of fighting right now, and I get to play both parts in my head. So, so that's basically, and then the whole thing what you do say, because it will affect ongoing relationships. Once there's no unringing a bell.
I think sometimes it's easier to be angry than be compassionate. Front conflict, it means you have to actually listen to the other person.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. I don't know did everybody hear that? That sometimes it's easier to be angry than to be compassionate. And if you do enter into conflict, you have to hear the other person's point of view, and then you have to be called upon to use that compassion. Yeah. Oh, Liz.
I was going to say, related to what you said, I don't avoid conflict so much as avoiding going into conflict over my own grief, that whatever it is that I'm butting up against, it is much easier for me to go in angry than to go in grieving, right? If I'm not going into conflict with some level of
able to enter that conflict from that place of strength and centeredness. Kind of no telling what's going to happen to us once we enter it. I feel that. Yeah. Okay.
I sometimes fight, sometimes flight, but sometimes when it's you've done the fight maybe a couple of times,
Mhm.
then there's a sense of hopelessness and there's just pointlessness. You just feel like I'm done.
Yeah,
I walk away.
it's futile. Like, why bother anymore?
Yeah.
Just been through this too much. Absolutely. And so there's a lot of different things about the avoiding conflict of flight. What are a couple of reasons that on the other side of this that you or someone you know might enter into conflict with that kind of gladiatorial stance? It's like, oh, I want to fight, but I'm gonna win.
When you're speaking truth to power,
Mm.
stick your neck out. And hey,
Mhm.
you don't know if they're gonna cut off your head.
That's true. That's true.
By definition, they have the powers.
Mhm.
I often find myself entering in conflict on others based on, I have a certain skill set. So I'm more likely to jump in and defend somebody other who's being assaulted or being, victimized than myself.
Mm.
And so I think for me that's conflict on behalf of others.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we're actually going to talk next week. Today is really about conflict interpersonally between two people or a small community. Next week we're going to talk about intercultural conflict. So when different people groups and who often have different amounts of power have a conflict, that's a whole other set of ethics and wisdom that we're going to draw on next week in this. But just put that out there.
With regards to the intent to win, for me it's interesting because conflict that I prefer to enter into is, I'm willing to concede. So I come into it understanding that there's a possibility of compromise. Typically when I come into conflict where I want to win and I'm going to win, means that the issue is escalated and we've collectively let it get to a point where we can't enter into that conversation from that position of compromise. And that's when, especially when you get particularly explosive about your position, it's because all that fuel is already on the fire and you let yourself get hit with it.
I can totally relate to that. Sometimes it happens particularly on Facebook. I mean, it happens in a lot of different ways, but for me the other day I was on this Facebook argument and I felt myself being so amped up by it. I was writing these things that were like, I'm 1,000% right and you're a total imbecile. And then I look and then I delete it because it's ridiculous. But like, what is going on with me? Why am I so amped up right now? And it's because there's a history there. It's not just this one moment that's happening. Like, I've been building up some stuff. I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, but that's that's resonating with me. And there's this. It's partly because it's explosive because I haven't dealt with the conflicts as they've led up to that point. And I think if I had, often it wouldn't be so difficult. So there's these different negative ways that we approach conflict oftentimes that don't actually lead to healing or to progress. And so today we're going to talk just for a few minutes about some healthy alternative approaches to this thing we call conflict. Paul, in a letter to the Romans, this church in Rome, ends up talking a little bit about changing our views of suffering, particularly when that suffering comes from a conflictual relationship, and that many of us just want to run from it. But he talks about how suffering can lead to endurance. And endurance can lead to character. And character ultimately leads to hope, and being someone who rests in hope. And I think about this from kind of a spiritual, mystical lens. There's this thing called the dark night of the soul in the spiritual life that says that after we have lived on the sort of surface of our spiritual lives and kind of a very light and surface level connection to the divine and to the transcendent and to the deep truth that rests within us and that powerful presence of love, that if we're going to get below the surface of that, we have to go through conflict. We have to go through a valley, through a rocky place. And it is those rocky things, that conflict experience, that can actually get us to a place of deeper knowledge and intimacy with that divine spirit. And it's the same in our relationships. One teacher of mine says that conflict is an invitation to intimacy. Not just a negative thing to be avoided, but an invitation to intimacy. It's through conflict in your relationships that you can begin to be vulnerable with each other and encounter each other, hear and serve each other ultimately. So we heard the scripture that Chad read. The disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. And it's this constant thing, this early Jesus movement. They were following this guy who was like the ultimate, give up power and be in solidarity with other people for the common good. And they were arguing about who was the greatest all the time. I mean, it's amazing how tone deaf they were, and how tone deaf many of us are. But these disciples are arguing about who's the greatest, and Jesus responds to them that whoever is like a child, whoever is humble and heart like a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And I think there's a few actual practical things I want to leave you with today when we're talking about how do we approach conflict from a healthy way. There's actually there's an anatomy of conflict that's been described by a number of people, including these three Harvard Business School negotiation experts. And they say every conflict has these three, they write about it in this book called Difficult Conversations. It's wonderful. I recommend it. In fact, I can't find it because I lent it to one of you. Somebody that I know, I'm sure. And they say that every conflict has these three parts to it. First, it is what happened. And we go into conflicts thinking that we know the answer to what happened, that we have the whole story. And in fact, 100% of the time, you do not have the whole story, unless you have asked some questions first. And so when Jesus says you have to become like a child, I think about my daughter, Karis, and how she says, when I say, Karis, don't throw your food on the floor, she says, why? And I say, because I'll have to clean it up. And she says, why? And I says, because of ants. And then the why goes on until it ends up with physics or God. The two answers that come at the end of like 15 questions. And I don't know if she's tracking, but there is that curiosity of a child to really want to know. They're trying to understand, maybe not her age, but a little bit older. They're trying to understand what's going on here. And if we approached our conflicts less with, here, you have to understand why you wronged me, and we start by saying, what was going on for you when you walked out of the room the other day? It felt to me like you were disrespecting me. And then you can maybe learn some really important information about what was going on for them when they left the room. These really simple things that become huge sources of conflict in our lives. So the what happened conversation, if we can begin with that childlike why, we can begin to transform our conflict. The second part of the anatomy of a conflict is our feelings, the feelings conversation. So much of the time, especially guys, want to stay on the surface of, not to totally genderize it, but it's, we're socialized into these gender roles. We approach the conflict as that who is right and who is wrong, and that's all dependent on the facts. And I swear to you, I sent you that email, and you didn't read it, and so that's the source of our problem. And I'm going to search my Gmail to prove to you that I sent that email on time, and blah, anybody tracking me? There is this desire to have it all be about the facts and what happened, when really, I'm not mad because you didn't read the email. I'm mad because I feel disrespected or undermined or not cared for or valued or something like that. So with my daughter, she lets me know how I feel, how she feels, very much so. And we're training her now that at the table when I say, don't drop the thing on the floor, she says, Mama, tell me your feelings. She smiles and diffuses everything. So the what happened conversation, the how do I feel about a conversation, and finally the who I am conversation. So many of the conflicts that we have, the reason that we are fighting about it, the reason that we don't want to enter into it, is because our self-image is wrapped up in our fantasy of the result of the conversation. We are worried that if we don't win the conversation, that somehow that means that we are weak, or that we don't stand up for ourselves well, or that we're dumb and we're not good at arguing, or that we are wrong, or that we don't know enough, that our self-image becomes wrapped up in winning these conflicts. Because I think our culture teaches us that there's a zero-sum game in this world. We live in a competitive culture, and whoever rises to the top is the best, and everybody else is losers. You may have heard that talked about from fairly high political positions. This is a thing we have in our heads, and we become very worried about the result of this and what this means about who I am. But a child, their identity isn't wrapped up so much in that. Their identity is wrapped up in, does mommy and daddy love me? And that is what is really the driving force behind their behavior. And if we can become people who receive and accept and live out of this idea of grace, that the fundamental nature of the universe, the core of who God is, the creator, the sustainer, the animator of all things, that mysterious power and lover of our souls, is in fact a lover of our souls, is unconditionally loving, and that is pouring out of every atom in this universe. If we can come from a position of unconditional love and believe that at some level we are accepted and seen and held, then these conflicts in our lives don't have to hold such fear about what is at stake for our self-image. And so that is my prayer for this community, that we can, with each other and with our spouses and our partners and our friends and our neighbors and all the coworkers, everybody we have a relationship with, that we can approach it from a lens not of fear about what it means for us, but from a lens and a ground of grace. Amen. We invite you now to go to one of two different encounter groups. There will be a singing group in here.